We're about to get started. I just want to make sure that we have enough seats for everybody out there, and if we don't, I'll ask some of the panelists to move up to the dais to make room for everybody else in our audience. Thank you. This will now begin our Select Committee on Lowering California's High School Dropout Rate. This is the first hearing in a series of hearings that we plan to have during this two-year cycle. And we're going to focus this hearing on defining the problem of our high school dropout rate. And we've asked various speakers who know a lot about this issue to come in and make sure that we're all talking about the same information and really focusing in on this problem. It's my concern that this topic will not be covered with any depth during this budget crisis. And I want to make sure that we keep this conversation in the limelight because it is one of my priorities as a legislator. As some of you already know, this is my first term. I'm only 10 months in on the job, but this topic is very important to me personally because I was almost one of these statistics that we'll be talking about today. My parents were on welfare when I was born. We moved 10 times in K through 12, and I almost did not graduate from high school. I was raised that when you're 18, you're on your own and you need to be able to support yourself. So the most important thing to me was not graduating from high school, but making sure I had the job skills and could get a job that would pay me well enough to support myself at age 18. So I started working at 15 and a half, and I was working till 2 o'clock in the morning on school nights, missing most of my classes. And in my senior year, they told me halfway through my senior year, you don't have enough credits to graduate from high school. So I was facing that problem of, do I just drop out now and just get a job, or do I try to work less and study more? And it wasn't family pressure that kept me in school. It was that I didn't want to close any more doors than I felt were already close to me. I wanted to make sure that I had more options available to me, and that dropping out seemed to me on a personal level to be a limiting career path. So I started taking work study where I had to get up and go to school at 6:30 in the morning to get credit for the work that I was doing. I started taking classes at the adult school to make up for the credits that I needed to graduate. And when graduation day came, I still hadn't done it. I did not have a seat in the graduation line. And they set up all of the kids to graduate in alphabetical order. And they had the practice graduation ceremony, and I was not included. It wasn't until the day before graduation that one natural science teacher that I had, who originally thought I wasn't going to pass the class, said that I had done enough extra credit and enough makeup work that I would actually graduate. And they sat me in the graduation, A through Z, Allison Lewis, at the very end. They ultimately moved me because a friend of mine decided not to walk in the ceremony whose last name started with an M, so I got moved into the middle. But that's how close I came to being one of these statistics that we're talking about today and being a dropout in high school, just by coming that close to failing to graduate. And it wasn't because I wasn't smart enough. It was I didn't have the mentors. I didn't see it as a priority. And so a lot of these issues are very personal to me. When we talk about this, I am not thinking of it as the numbers. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the student who almost became a dropout. And after that, I had the opportunity to go to a community college, met a wonderful professor who talked me into joining the speech and debate team, found out I was good at something. 3 months later, won a gold medal at a national speech and debate competition, and it changed the course of my life forever. I was offered a scholarship to go to Chico State to debate for them. I went to Chico, but that was during the 1992 budget crisis when it was very similar to the one we have right now. Education was on the chopping block. As part of the way to balance the budget, state workers weren't getting paid. Everybody was hurting. And so I transferred to the best debate program I could find, the farthest away from California's budget crisis, and went to Cornell University and finished my degree there, and came back to California and went to law school in our UC system at Hastings College of the Law. And I had been practicing law for about 9 years when I decided that, I have something to add to this discussion. I don't think that my life story has to be a unique one. I think that is the promise of our country. And in California, that used to be the ideal that we held up, that everyone, no matter who you are or what background you came from, had the opportunity to succeed in our economy. And now, sitting here as a first-time legislator, I want to make sure that we focus on those issues, regardless of the budget crisis, because my story happened despite California's budget crisis. And I hope that we can tell that story for other kids who are going through our high schools right now. So I had some prepared remarks, but I think it's more important to focus on the speakers who we're going to have in front of our panel today. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I also want to take, just since this is our first hearing, I want to make sure that I thank the speaker for allowing me to create the Select Committee on Lowering California's high school dropout rate. It was nice timing that President Obama included the high school dropout rate in his first State of the Union address at the time that I was lobbying and advocating that we create the Select Committee in the Assembly. He also spoke in front of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and I think his words are probably better than the words that I can provide. But he said, dropping out is quitting on yourself. It's quitting on your country, and it is not an option. Not anymore. Not when our high school dropout rate has tripled in the past 30 years. So I think now's the time where we have the focus of our president on this issue, and I want to make sure that as Californians, we continue to focus on this issue because there's so much at stake. Joining us for our first speaker today is Carrick Ashley, the Director of Data Management for the California Department of Education. And it's a good place to start in defining the problem of the high school dropouts in California. So with that, I want to welcome you, Carrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm Carrick Ashley, Director of Data Management, Department of Education. Superintendent Jack O'Connell, in his press conference on dropouts last May, referred to the situation in California as a crisis. He has made it very clear to the Department of Education that his number one priority for him and his staff is to close the achievement gap. Closing the achievement gap is not just about test scores. It's about closing the gap that we have in graduation rates and dropout rates, as you'll see from the data that we'll present this morning. Just as a quick backdrop, we are about to launch for the first time in California's history, a longitudinal data system that's based on individual student identifiers that takes in 6.3 million kids in the state, student by student, and connects with those students demographic data, program participation information, the grade level of that student, the course enrollments, the course grades and credits for those students, discipline data that's required by the federal government, connected within that same data system of CalPADS, which for those who don't know is California Longitudinal Pupil Achievement Data System. So within CalPADS is also teacher data, and that teachers also have their own unique identifiers, which are referred to as SEIDs, S-E-I-D, which is statewide educator IDs. And with that teacher information is also some demographics along with the assignments that teachers are teaching. So between the data that's in CalPADS for students by their statewide student identifier, or SSID, we get course information. With the teachers and their teacher ID, we get course information that they're teaching. And it's between that course information that students are taking and course information that teachers are teaching that connects the teacher and student data within the system. Along with that is the data that comes in with every statewide assessment data that a student takes, whether that be the CELT or the CASE or STAR. So any of those statewide assessments will be within the system. As far as a schedule rollout, training has already begun with school districts on CalPADS. Beginning Monday, we roll out the first functionality of CalPADS, which is the administrative use at the district level. Districts need to go through the same process that we're going through at the California Department of Education, and that's defining who's going to have access to the data. Since it is student-level data, it's not to be accessed by everyone. There are privacy protections that must take place. Personally, myself, I will not have access to the data system. I've got technical people who will, but I personally don't need access to the individual student-level data. And the same as goes for school districts. They will have to go through this process of defining and identifying who will have access to the data and who needs access and what level of access. So that functionality rolls out starting Monday. After that, the first phase, after the administration functionality, begins on October 5th, where districts will then actively engage in the CalPAD system, getting SSIDs, maintaining SSIDs, reporting their enrollment. Then later on in November, December, a second phase gets added to CalPADS, which is the submission of data on English learners in the spring. Then at the end of the year, there's phase 4, which also has to do with course credits and discipline data and program participation. So when the system gets turned on Monday, it's not a turnkey and all functionality is there. It's a rollout that happens throughout the school year. But one of the advantages of having such a system is that we'll have more flexibility in the data that we have. We can put together reports that are more tailored to the needs of both policymakers and local school districts. Every time a student enters or exits a school, the school will go into the system and will report either an enrollment status or a withdrawal status. So it's these withdrawal codes that are used for determining dropouts. In the last 20, 30 years, when schools have reported dropouts, they reported to us aggregate numbers. In other words, they report to us how many 9th graders have dropped out. They would just give us a number. How many 10th graders? How many 11th graders? And then we would take that data, which is basically, which is all aggregate data, and it's basically an estimate of what the dropout rates are. With withdrawal codes that we've been collecting for the last 2 years, we are going student by student. Schools are reporting to us why a student has left and by one of these 28 withdrawal codes, and it's based on these codes that we can now calculate more accurate dropout data. Now, we've had 2 years worth. This fall, they're reporting a third year to us, the graduation class of 09. And so about a year from now, they'll be reporting to us, and we'll be collecting our first full set of 4 years of data longitudinally based on these statewide student identifiers. So with the graduating class of 2010, for the first time, we'll be able to do a graduation rate that is even more accurate than what we have today, because it'll be based on these statewide student identifiers across 4 years and not just 1 year of data. I'm not going to go through these next 5 slides. I'm going to go through them very quickly. It's just to identify for anyone in the audience who would like to get access themselves to the graduation and dropout data that we report on the Department of Ed's website. You'll see from the CDE website, this is the data and statistics page, and right in the middle under highlights is something called DataQuest, which is our way of reporting data to the public. So if you click on DataQuest, it'll take you to this page from which you can choose what level of report you want: state, district, school. The subject matter, in this case, from the drop-down menu, I've chosen dropouts, and if you click Submit, you'll get this page, which will ask you what year of dropout data would you like to have. And as you can see, it goes back all the way to 91, 92, though we do have aggregate data that goes back further than that. So once you choose a year, then you choose what kind of report you want. So in this case, we chose the year 2007 and 8. You can get this dropout report by grade and ethnicity. You can get it by school. You can get it by county. You can get it by the exit code. And you'll end up with a report that looks like this that, of course, nobody can read from their seats, which is why I've taken the opportunity to take this report and blow it up and provide a thumbnail sketch of what this report says. So again, you can get this report by statewide, by district, by school. In this case, these are district-wide rates, and it just compares the dropout rate from 06-07 to 07-08. We won't go through these in detail, but it's enough to point out, as you can just, looking at the far right column there, that there's quite a discrepancy, a gap that needs to be closed between the large numbers of African American and Hispanic students dropping out and the rest of the population in California. And then if you take that Hispanic population, which is at 23.8%, and you start breaking that down and disaggregating it by those that are English learners, you'll see that the gap is really much more acute for African American students. Many of the 23.8% Hispanic dropouts there are English learners, and many of them come to us after high school has begun. And so when you even start factoring in for the language difficulties that they're facing and the African American students are not, you can see especially that population, there's quite a large gap that needs to be closed. If you disaggregate that further, African American males especially have an extremely high dropout rate compared to the rest of the population. So collecting data on 6.3 million students doesn't come without some challenges. The first of which, to collect dropout data, is grades 9 through 12, which means that we depend on 3,000 high schools and alternative schools in our state reporting this data to us accurately, student by student. That does take a lot of effort. We have advocated for more resources for schools and districts to do this work because it's not easy work. Sometimes families will pick up and leave and move without telling the schools where they've gone, and to try to identify what happens to those students takes resources and phone calls, and sometimes multiple phone calls and contacts to find out what happens to students who leave the system. And until now, schools and districts just haven't been given specific resources to do data activities in spite of all the efforts, both from legislative staff and CDE as well. 4 years of longitudinal data is still about 1.5 years away, but with the graduating class of 2010, we will have that 4 years of data. The shared accountability that's needed is just to point out to you that much of the dropout rate is the public perception of it, and because we report these rates by school, it's important to note that a student may have gone to 3 or 4 different schools within a school year and then dropped out. Well, it's the last school in which the student attended that gets attributed with that dropout. Dropouts are usually not a one-time occurrence. It's something that happens to kids over a period of time. but it's always the last school that the student attended that gets attributed with that dropout, and hence their dropout rate could be higher than others, especially if you're a school that happens to focus primarily on serving at-risk students. So it is a shared accountability. Something else that should be pointed out is that these are 9 through 12 rates, so it doesn't account for students that may have dropped out before they even entered the 9th grade. So, actions to address the dropout crisis. Of course, entire hearings can be held on, what we do to address the problem, and folks at the Department of Education, more eloquent and knowledgeable than I, should be at the table when those discussions take place. I have the easy job, if you want to call it that, of just collecting the data. Solving the problem, is a much harder thing to do. So one thing, though, that helps us is that data doesn't solve the problem, but it does help us highlight where the problems are and where the problems need to be addressed. And so the more public that we can put out our data and make it available both to policymakers and to the general public, to school personnel and district personnel, the better off we are. Just more data is always better. It's a matter of then interpreting the data and what you do with it. We do want to encourage the idea of early warning predictive models for schools and districts. It would be nice to have that at the state level, but we just don't have it now. But there are ways and there are things that schools and districts can do to identify some of those early warning signs that students are at risk of dropping out, specifically credits earned, attendance. If you just take those two factors alone, you can identify pretty early in a student's career that they are at risk of dropping out by a certain number of days absent within a school year, one or more classes failing within a school year, and schools and districts can do a pretty good job of identifying who that is. We do want to, the superintendent and the state school attendance review board does identify model programs. This just actually happened recently. We'd like to take those model programs and use them as examples for others to see if they can use whatever things they've learned in their programs to be able to transfer to others. Not all things are transferable, but at least if we have some model programs to take a look at, that's always a good idea. Of course, we've got many different education option programs within the state. We know that kids in the classroom don't all learn in the same manner, and so it should be obvious to us that kids in school settings don't all learn the same in the same school setting. So different types of school settings are good for different types of kids, and that's why we have different education option programs, alternative schools, community day schools, independent studies, even distance learning will work for some students that won't work for others. And so we want to take a look at different school settings that will be successful for students. There is a document out there that's on our website, and this is the link for it. It's called Zero Dropouts for California. It provides some summary of resources and research out there, as well as defining better than I have this morning what some of those alternative and education option programs are. Just for those that don't know, the school attendance review, every district has a school attendance review board locally, and we have one at the state level as well, and it's the state level that identified those model programs that I talked about on the earlier slide. But these local panels, their very reason for existence is to take a look at students that are having problems with attendance and coming up with interventions to reduce dropouts based on their own local data. And so any data that we can help make available to them, of course, it would be a help. The handbook here is just a resource for anyone who is interested. So we do have specific contacts for these programs. Carl Sheff works for me, and he's much more knowledgeable than I am on dropout rates, and Paula Mishima is our project lead on CalPADS, and a data resource page for anybody on our website for CalPADS, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. And normally we'd have more committee members here, but being the last day that we could have hearings and on a Friday when people are going back to the district, you have just me. I'm going to try to keep my questions for you limited to the data, because I recognize that you don't make the decisions on the policy, but you are trying to make sure that we have the most accurate data. So two questions stand out to me The first one is, what are you doing to ensure, or within your group of folks, because I know you've got Carl too, to ensure that the data is accurate? Are you making it all on the locals to make sure their data is accurate, or are you doing any testing of that data to make sure it's accurate?
That's a great question. So over the years, there has been, and rightfully so, criticism of some of the data that we've collected in the past, especially that data that's been aggregate data, because there is no way to audit that data. But in the last 2 years, by collecting SSIDs, there's at least the possibility of going out and auditing that data because it is reported student by student. CalPADS, which we haven't had up until this fall, will be a system that will assist schools and districts in making that data more accurate. We've never had an automated system until this school year with the implementation of CalPADS to do some automatic checking of some of this data. For instance, if a student leaves my school and goes to enroll in your school, when you go into the system and enroll this new student, an email will automatically come back to me saying your student or your former student has now enrolled in a new school in California. Please check your data system and exit them properly, and exit them as of this date, so that there's no overlap in enrollment status. So the system itself will provide some automatic checks into the system and in email contacts and that sort of thing that will help make the data more accurate. Let me also say that there is a data grant out there under ARA where states can apply for specifically to augment their statewide longitudinal data systems. There will be an application that goes in from California, and one of the areas to be addressed is developing an audit system for the data that's in the system.
But
so we'll be applying for that.
Is that going to happen through the Department of Education, though? Are you going to actually go out and do any audits, or are you looking at grants for locals to do audits?
Assuming that we win this bid, because it is a competitive grant, that will be part of our audit system to actually go out and do some checks.
Assuming you don't win the grant, do you have any plans to go out and audit any of the local school districts to ensure that the data that you're getting is accurate?
Well, it's finding resources. We would have to find some resources or redirect resources to do that. But right now, there are no resources for that.
Okay, last question I have for you, which is probably the same answer, but you mentioned that we're not tracking those that drop out before they even get to the 9th grade. Are there any, other than resources, impediments for you to start doing a system like that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question because I obviously wasn't as clear about that statement as I should have been. And that is, the 9 through 12 rates that we publish on our website only count the students 9 through 12. We get exit codes from every student in the state beginning in kindergarten. So it's not that we don't have the data or that we don't track the students, we do. But when we publish rates, and the rates that we send back to the federal government, they specifically want a rate that begins at 9th grade through the 12th grade. So when we say our statewide dropout rate is 20%, that does not include, that 20% does not include any kids that have dropped out prior to 9th grade. But we do track them.
And where can I find that data?
We're going to be posting 7th and 8th grade rates beginning this school year. And then, of course, we would have to put together any ad hoc rates in reports if anyone wanted rates beyond that.
When you say this school year, can you be a little more specific? You have a month you're planning on?
Well, they submit data to us this fall on the graduates of 09. And so all of that data that we take from this data that they submit in the fall, we put together and post on DataQuest, and that will be done this spring.
And when you do that, are you only going to be posting for this year that was reported in the fall, or are you going to post some historical data?
So all of the data all the dropout reports that we report are on a year-by-year basis. So as you saw from the website, those go back to 91, 92, but they are a year-by-year dropout rate. A 4-year dropout rate is actually it's taking a 1-year rate and extrapolating it as if it were 4 years. So we won't have the true 4-year data until we have the graduating class of 2010.
No, I get that for high school. I'm talking now about the 7th and 8th graders.
Ah.
So you're going to release some data on 7th and 8th graders starting this fall.
We've actually listed and put on DataQuest for the last number of years, going back to that 91, 92. You can find numbers of dropouts for grades 7 and 8 on the website, and it is historical. What we've never done is take those numbers and turn them into a rate, a percentage, if you will. So that's what we'll be doing for the first time.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
We now have Russ Rumberger, the director of the California Dropout Research Project, the person who can really it's going to be the same presentation. Hold on.
This is your, yeah.
And we want to try to make as much room for folks, so I'm asking some of the presenters to come and sit up at the dais here so that we can make room for those that are standing up against the wall to come and sit down. Trust me, you don't want to stand for 2 hours. But please come and find a seat. And I know Russ has a PowerPoint that he now has up and ready to go. So, Mr. Rumberger, welcome. Thank you so much for flying in this morning to be here today.
Sure, I'm happy
Appreciate
to do
having
it. I'm going to try to give a really brief overview of the dropout crisis, which is obviously a very tough task to do in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to present a little bit of data and give some overview statements. And much of what I'll have to say, I have a website from the project that I'll show you a link to, and then you can follow up with anything that you're interested in more detail. So as Assembly members said earlier on, our president has made dropout a priority for this administration, which is great, I think, in terms of putting money out there. But of course, California's had this crisis for some time, so it I think gives us added ammunition, hopefully financial ammunition, if not political ammunition as well, to address the crisis. So as I mentioned, I'm the director of the California Dropout Research Project. It was started about 2 years ago with funding from 4 foundations. So we've been putting out in that period of time, we actually have kind of 3 charges. One of them is to put out new research, try to focus as much of the research as we can on California. There's lots and lots of research nationally. Much of it, I think, is applicable to California, but we do have some unique circumstances in California, including a demographic profile that doesn't quite match many other states. So I think we have additional challenges in our state that other states do not face. The second activity is that we did put out a policy report last year that many of you may have seen, I hope, and if not, it's all available on our website as well, on really overview of the crisis and also what the state should do about it or could do about it. And then we've disseminated this work. As I said, everything that we put out is on our website, so you're welcome to go there and get that. So there's really 4 dimensions to the dropout crisis, and I'm going to try to talk really briefly about 3 of them today. I was asked to, both talking about the magnitude and trends. Carrick has already talked about some of that, so I don't have to go into as much detail. The social and economic consequences of dropping out, the causes, and then solutions, and we'll talk, I guess, on some other time about solutions. So even these 3 are a lot of material. I'm actually writing a book on dropouts, and I've got a chapter on each of those, and there could be a lot of material in each of them. So I'm just going to really give some brief highlights into each of these 3 dimensions of the problem this morning. So I want to talk just a little bit about what we mean by dropout and also what we mean by graduate, because we have technical definitions of them, but I think it's important to kind of start out with conceptually thinking about what it is. And there's kind of 3 ways to think about dropout. One of them is dropout as a status. That is, at any one point in time, a student is either a dropout or not a dropout. So if a student is enrolled or pursuing a credential, they're not considered a dropout. They've already graduated, and then they're a student. So at any one point in time, we can measure this. So like Carrick was talking about the data system, at any one point in any time of the school year, that student is either enrolled or they've withdrawn, and so the data system will allow us to do that. So we can think of that as a kind of snapshot picture. So we can measure dropout status at any age, and the federal government collects this data for adults Typically, adults don't go back to school, so their dropout status is kind of a terminal status. But in fact, it's like marital status. It can change over time. So one day you can be a dropout. The next day you can be re-enrolled. So it's kind of a snapshot view of dropout. Another way to think about dropout is as an event, and that is what happens between time 1 and time 2. And that's really a lot of the data that the state now releases. So they say, last year you were enrolled as a student. During the course of that year, you dropped out of school, and as Carrick said, the last school you attended is the one that you've attributed to. But the point is you're looking at a change in status from time 1 to time 2. And that period can vary. Now, the state typically reports it every year. So they say you were enrolled sometime the previous year. As of the next fall, you're not enrolled somewhere, so we're going to call you a dropout. So that's dropout as an event. The third way to think about dropout is as a process. And this is actually much more important when thinking about causes and solutions. That is, what is it that causes people to drop out of school? And it's a process in the sense that the things that predict whether a student drops out do occur over time. So as early as elementary school, some studies have shown, we can see a profile of kids who are more prone. It doesn't mean you can do it totally accurately, but for example, if they start missing a lot of school, even in elementary school, or they start misbehaving, having problems with other students, things like that. So in order to kind of better understand the problem in terms of causes and solutions, it's really important to think of dropout as a process. So each of these definitions or concepts of dropout is important in understanding, I think, the problem. And then the last thing, I just want to show that the relationship between dropout and graduate, they are part of the same process, but they're looking at it in different kind of aspects of it. So I have a very simple diagram what I draw there, which is a student enrolls in school. And just because they enroll in school doesn't mean they're on the path to graduating, because if they're enrolled, they then have to actually attend. And that's why we look at attendance so much, because just because a student's enrolled, and there's a formal definition of enrolled or not enrolled or whatever, but in terms of education and achieving, moving towards graduation, they actually have to attend school. But even that is not enough, because attending school does not ensure they graduate. As you mentioned in your case, Assemblymember Huber, that even if you attend, if you're not earning credits, you're not moving towards graduation. So you have to earn credits to graduate, and you also, in our state, have to pass an exit exam. So those are two kind of indicators of progress. Anywhere along the line, along that progression line, a student could quit and drop out. So we want to look at dropouts because that's a kind of first indicator that they're in trouble. But just because they don't drop out doesn't mean they're going to graduate. So it is important to make the distinction between, first of all, the different conceptions of dropout, but also thinking about dropout as kind of one indicator of this process. But the ultimate goal is that we want all students to graduate with a degree. And in order to do that, we not only have to prevent them from dropping out, but we have to ensure that they graduate. So preventing dropout isn't really sufficient as a focus to ensure graduation. So they're part of the process, but they're somewhat distinct. So I just want to make that point. So I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. We actually have just put out a statistical brief today. It'll be on our website. Well, it may be up this morning, but for sure it'll be up by this afternoon when I get home. And that is, we took the latest numbers that the State Department put out, and we looked at the long-term trends over the last 10 years. And the two dropout rates that the state computes are what we call event rates, that second definition I mentioned, and that is it's really an annual event rate. And they have done this for, as Carrick mentioned, for a long time. So both one-year rates, dropout rates for each grade level, and then 4-year estimated rates, which was the kind of estimated probability that someone's going to drop out over the 4 years of high school rather than a single year of high school. And then these adjusted rates are the ones that the CDE has put out in the last 2 years based on the new data system that says, oh, we can now verify these transfers, and students who previously may have been reported as transfers and therefore not considered a dropout had to be verified in the new data system. And if they weren't verified, the state reclassified those students as dropouts. So the state for the last 2 years has actually put out 2 sets of dropout numbers and dropout rates, and that's what those rates show. So you can see the long-term trends are basically that dropout rates have been going up, except this last year there was a quite dramatic drop in dropouts. The second set of indicators, in some ways, are maybe more important because, again, our ultimate goal is to get kids to graduate. And that is the state reports actually two graduation numbers. The first one is the one they report to the federal government for accountability purposes. That's the top number. And you can see that the trend was upwards for the first few years in this last decade and peaked in 2001-02 and then has basically dropped down. And you can see the line where the high school exit exam was instituted. The second one at the bottom is called a ninth grade cohort rate, which is really ultimately what we want and what the CalPads will be able to report accurately in the future, and that is how many ninth graders actually graduate 4 years later. Well, we don't know the number of entering ninth graders in the data system now because it includes repeat ninth graders. So there's this bubble of kids who have actually been in ninth grade more than 1 year. So that rate tends to be understated. So this is kind of a lower bound estimate of what the true rate is. And you can see there was a trend upward until the year before the exit exam was instituted, and then this quite dramatic drop, and then it's started to go back up a little again. So let me just mention a couple other things about the nature of the problem, and that is it's very important to keep in mind that the problem is concentrated. And by concentrated, I mean that it's concentrated among certain populations of students more than others. Carrick showed the data on race. We know there's racial differences, but I just put one up for English learners as another example. English learners constitute about 15% of the high school students in our state. They constitute 30% of the dropouts in our state. So English learners are disproportionately likely to drop out, as are minority students, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as students who are in free and reduced lunch, as an example. The second aspect of concentration is the fact that it's concentrated within certain schools and districts. So 1% of the schools, which are about 25 high schools, account for 21% of the dropouts in our state. 10 districts in our state account for 36% of the dropouts. And non-traditional, what I call non-traditional schools, which are both charters and alternative schools, account for 12% of enrollment, but 49% of the dropouts. So when we think about the nature of the problem and the way we want to solve it, then we have to remember that this problem of dropouts is concentrated among certain populations of students and institutions. Okay, consequences. There are a whole host of consequences. I can't go into great detail about that this morning, obviously. But on the left, we can think about consequences in two ways. One of them is individual consequences, and the second is social consequences. Individual consequences are what happens to the dropouts themselves. And social scientists from many different disciplines, psychology, sociology, economics, have traced a whole range of individual consequences. They include lower wages, higher rates of unemployment, increased crime, increased rate of non-marital births among females, poorer health, reduced political participation, and reduced intergenerational mobility. So all these are kind of consequences to it. Now, what's important to keep in mind in thinking about these is the fact that there is, and it's much harder, though, to establish a causal relationship between dropping out actually causing these consequences, as opposed to the fact that many students who drop out have many other issues in their lives. They have lower ability, they have less motivation, they come from poor backgrounds that affects both the likelihood that they'll graduate and these consequences. And so what social scientists have been trying to do for years, and they're getting better at it, is to tease out the effect of the dropping out per se or on these consequences. And in most cases what they find is even those students who are likely to drop out have a lot of other background factors that influence both of these outcomes, that is dropping out and these social consequences or individual consequences. The fact of dropping out actually is a causal factor beyond that. So for example, roughly if you say there's huge earnings differences, as I'll show you in a minute, between dropouts and graduates, maybe half of those differences roughly we can attribute to the fact of dropping out, and half we can attribute to the fact of other factors that may influence both dropping out and that. So it's important to keep in mind. The second thing that's really important from policy point of view is that these individual consequences have social costs. That is, they affect all of us. Dropouts not only have a bum life for themselves in many cases, but they affect the rest of the population, and that's why policymakers need to worry about it. So those social costs include things like reduced national income and state income, reduced tax revenues, increased crime costs the state and the taxpayers lots of money, increased social services, poorer health, reduced political participation, and reduced intergenerational mobility. Those have social consequences as well as individual consequences. So here's just as an example of some data on some of the labor market differences. So if you look at annual earnings, graduates earn about 37% more than dropouts do. Unemployment, 24% lower unemployment rate. 74% more likely to be employed and have a pension plan, and 97% more likely to have health insurance, which we know is really a big issue now. So those are just some of the ways in which dropouts and graduates differ from each other. There are many others that I can't go into. Here's the latest unemployment rate. Well, actually, not the latest. It was through January. But you can see the highest unemployment rate in the nation is among high school dropouts. So it's, again, another indicator of this. Again, I can't go into great detail, but we did release in the spring some cost estimates for not only the state of California, but all the major cities in California. This is just an example. These are dropout rates actually for grades 7 through 12, not 9 through 12. So we looked at the total number of dropouts in the state, and we used some earlier estimates from another study that we'd done to say what would it cost the state. And we have research that shows roughly about half of all dropouts will return to school on their own accord. So we just did a conservative estimate that says, well, if half of them drop out and the other half return to school, half of them, I should say, remain dropouts, what would be the cost to the state? And we came up with an estimate of $24 billion. Los Angeles as a city, $2 billion. Fresno as a city, $555 million. And this is 1 year's dropout. So each year, if a similar number have dropped out, again, assuming half didn't come back, it would generate this cost every single year. So the social cost, the economic cost of California are huge. So lastly, let me just speak about causes. Again, this is a huge topic that I'll just be able to say very briefly a few things about. As I mentioned earlier, it's actually much harder to think about causes than we can think about kind of reasons or predictors of dropping out. Because dropping out is a complex process. It doesn't occur overnight. It occurs over a long period of time. There are many other things going on in these students' lives. And so it's hard to tease out a specific factor that may influence these students. So it is difficult to actually figure out specific causes. Another thing to think about is the difference between individual factors and institutional factors. That is, individual factors are the factors about kids and specifically more about their families that may influence whether they drop out. Their behavior, their attendance, their ability, their motivation, all those kinds of things. We can also kind of subdivide those between kind of demographic factors and behavioral attitudinal factors. And the reason we want to do that is demographic factors we can't do much about. Behavioral attitudinal factors we can do something about. So the first set is kind of unalterable characteristics, and the second are alterable characteristics. So in the research, we've tried to tease out the effects of demographic factors from behavioral attitudinal factors. The second thing we want to separate out is, and again, Carrick alluded to this, is what we call proximal factors versus distal factors. Proximal factors are the factors that influence the decision to drop out immediately preceding the event, that is in high school. Whereas distal factors are things that we could see in elementary or middle school that might predict whether they drop out. And there is a lot of research being done on these early indicators, specifically more in middle school indicators, that says we can not predict with certainty, but we can identify students who are likely to drop out with some of these characteristics. Again, things that we hope are alterable, like attendance and attitudes towards schools. The second domain that we've looked at in the research is institutional factors, specifically school and community characteristics that may influence whether students drop out. And again, there's a whole bunch of that. One of the distinctions to make in the institutional arena is the differences between resources and practices. You know, resources are things that cost money, obviously. They're not just material, fiscal resources, but material resources like more counselors or more teachers or more programs. And of course, that's the climate we're in now of saying we don't have a lot of resources. What can we do about it? Well, there are things we can do about it because there are also practices that we can identify that are more effective at keeping kids in school. Now, some of those practices may be instituted by personnel and may cost some money, but in fact, some of the practices could be done without more money. So it is important to kind of make distinction between resource characteristics that obviously will cost more money and effective practices that may not cost more money or a lot less money. And then lastly, I want to make the distinction between dropout and achievement. Much of the focus of policy, of research, and everything else has been focusing on achievement, and achievement typically defined as test scores. Dropping out is another indicator, and a really important indicator of achievement, and one that I think doesn't get enough attention. And the reason it is important to make a distinction between the two is the factors that may influence students' achievement in test scores may be different than the factors that influence whether they graduate or not. So one example would be student behavior. Student behavior, or I should say misbehavior, is much stronger predictor of dropping out than it is of grades. I mean, or indirectly it may affect grades or test scores, for example. So the factors that, again, may influence whether a student has a high test score is more likely to focus on classroom practices, teacher characteristics, curriculum, and things like that, whereas the factors that may influence whether students stay in school may have to do with having relationships with meaningful relationships with adults, counselors, mentors, something like that, that may not have much direct impact on their grades in school. So I'm not going to talk about the data in these because I think I'm running out of time. But this is an example from one of our studies on reasons students report having dropped out after the fact, missed too many days of school, failing school, did not like school. There's family-related reasons. Girls report being pregnant as dropping out. And boys are more likely to report getting a job as a reason that they might drop out. But again, we want to make the distinction between the reasons they give after the fact versus the cause that may actually have led them to dropping out of school. We did another study at risk indicators. This is high school risk indicators, but for example, look at the one in failing ninth grade. The single best predictor of dropping out in high school is failing ninth grade, failing courses in ninth grade. So our data system will allow us to do this in the future. It'll be a very important indicator. Overage, you can see, is a pretty big indicator, but just using 3 indicators, overage, failing ninth grade, and even getting a low GPA in ninth grade, that is below 2.0, you put those 3 factors together, the students at risk, only 61% graduated in this cohort of 2004 graduates. 89% of the students that didn't have any of those factors graduated. So that's just a simple example of some predictors that we can look at. And this graph really shows the fact that schools matter. So in other words, the dropout rates in high SES schools are lower than the dropout rates in low SES schools, even controlling for individual SES. In other words, school context matters. And a lot of dropouts actually attend schools that are very disadvantaged in many dimensions. So let me just finish by saying there's, I think, 3 major implications of all the research on causes that I think are important when we then go on to the discussion of interventions. And that is that the act of dropping out is both academic and social. That is, it's not just an academic problem, and therefore solutions to the dropout crisis really have to focus both on the social domain and the academic domain. The second thing is to start before high school. Again, we have a lot of research that says we can identify, not with certainty, but with a higher degree of probability, students who are likely to drop out before they enter high school, so interventions should start before they enter high school. And the third thing is that we should focus both on individual student characteristics, attendance, attitudes, motivation, achievement, but also the institutions that serve them. Some of those are easier to do through policy than others. Changing family practices is a hard thing, but there are a lot of parent involvement programs that try to do that. Schools, obviously, we have more control over what happens in schools. And communities. Community environments are really important. So the key to solving this problem really involves focusing both on individual students and and on the institutions that serve them. So again, there's the website for all our work, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. You covered, I think, a very wonderful treatise on the problem, on really covering from top to bottom what's going on with the dropout crisis. I only have one question for you, really, because I do think that you covered most of it, and I even think you covered this, but I just want to emphasize it because I got a lot of emails from folks who couldn't make it to the committee today that, the reason our dropout rate is so bad is because we've got 34-to-1 student-teacher ratios, for example, and now we're at 37 because of budget crisis, so we're going to see an increase in the dropout rate because you just changed unfortunately, the legislature did cut education, and we're seeing higher class rates. Or it's because of racism and sexism and the achievement gap. And from the research that you've covered this in the entire state of California, what I hear you saying is it's really concentrated in certain school districts where we have most of the problem. And if it were things like the student-teacher ratio, you would expect to see the dropout rate being more consistent as a causal factor throughout the state instead of just in particular concentration. So what do you say to those folks who, everybody seems to have their opinion of this is the root cause of the dropout rate, whether it's student-teacher ratio or some other cultural insensitivities that are happening in the classroom. And what do you say to those folks?
Well, I would say that no single factor is the root cause. I mean, and probably there's more root causes located within families as they are with other areas of student achievement than in schools themselves. One of the things that researchers try to do is kind of, to the best of their ability, kind of disaggregate the variation in outcomes of students, whether it be test scores or dropout rates, as variations related to individual characteristics and family characteristics versus schools. And still, all the research shows consistently that more of the variation can be explained by differences in family and family circumstances than in schools. And I would say that's probably true with dropouts as well as test scores. So within the school arena, however, resources do matter. I would say in general that in the case of dropout, the student-teacher ratio itself is probably less of a causal factor than it would be for student achievement outcomes. Because as I mentioned, dropping out is more than just about student achievement. And so I would say student-teacher ratios probably matter more in raising achievement levels in California, because we do have research that says that matters. There is some research that says teacher ratios actually do matter with respect to dropouts as well, with lower student-teacher ratios being a better condition. But in the larger scheme of things, of this problem, I would say it's only one probably small piece of it. I don't know if that's sufficient, but.
Yes, thank you so much, and I look forward to going to the website and seeing your updated research that I believe you were releasing today or putting on the website today, correct?
Yeah, right.
So thank you so much for coming. Some of the social consequences of dropouts was raised in Mr. Rumberger's presentation, and I think that our next witness will help illuminate some of those issues here locally. We have Sacramento Police Chief Rick Brazil here, coming up now to talk about the law enforcement's perspectives on the dropout crisis and the trends seen in crime as it relates to dropouts. Thank you so much for coming.
Madam Chair, welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm Rick Brazil. I'm the police chief in Sacramento. I'm also today representing well over 400 police chiefs, sheriffs, district attorneys, and public safety officials throughout the state of California and fight crime investing kids as well. What I think I'll be able to do is put some context around what Mr. Rumberger described as some of the outcomes, and especially when it comes to some of the social consequences and social costs, because we actually see it on the streets. And what I'd like to do is address the problem in several different areas. First, with what are some of the impacts that are out there and the impacts on the social consequences that we see out in the communities. And that we've seen that dropouts are 3.5 times more likely to get arrested than those who don't drop out, and 8 times more likely to end up in our jails or in our prisons. And I believe Mr. Rumberger would echo that when you look at some of the consequences when it comes to the income and the jobs and the opportunities. A report done by Fight Crime Investing Kids determined that if we can increase the graduation rate, and there's that distinction, graduation versus dropout, increase the graduation rate by 10 percentage points, we can then have an impact of about reducing 500 murders and 20,000 aggravated assaults in our state. And so that's significant when you start putting in that context with what's going on the street. So what are the 3 topic areas that I'd like to discuss today is the importance of a complete education system, the indicators of how do we indicate within schools who's likely to drop out, which is what Mr. Rumberger was talking about, and his indicators, and then how do we keep children engaged in school, because that's critical, and there's some anecdotal stuff that I'd like to share with you, if I may. So one of the important pieces that we see in our community and in communities across the state is the sooner we get children into the education system, meaning preschool and quality preschools, the more we develop the social skills for just being responsible for their actions. I steal your toy, and then I'm told that that's not an appropriate thing to do, and we both work on how to handle that. So children are learning social skills in preschool that you don't get once you start into the education system. So it's really important for us as a state to look at the education system from not just that high school year when we're looking at dropouts, those high school years, the middle school years, but all the way up into the preschool years. And what are the successes of children who are given opportunities to go to preschool? One of the studies that was done indicated that when we start children in preschool, they're 44% more likely to graduate than those who don't. And so and again, it's one of those social skills that you learn in preschool. What we see, and this relates back to the process component of what Mr. Rumberger talked about, is how do we determine the early warning signs of children that are going to drop out of school? I formed a youth advisory committee, and it's made up of students from all the high schools in our city. And let me give you a little background on our city, because I think we meet the demographic identifiers that Mr. Rumberger talked about. Harvard did a study on diversity in the United States, and Sacramento is the most diverse city in this country, and our schools represent that. And we've got multiple school districts within the city of Sacramento. So I have representatives from each one of the high schools, public, private, and charter. And we meet on a regular basis. And last year, the task of the students was to help us identify where do children take that path of continuing through school, and where do children take that path of dropping out. And it was unanimous across the board from the students when they went back into their research projects, is that the tipping point for us are those middle school years. That's where the students are starting to get left behind. That's where they start, peer pressure pushes them into that misbehavior group that Mr. Rumberger talked about. And that's that tipping point for us. So we've been focused so long on the high school juniors and seniors, keeping them in school, when the focus, really when you talk to the students, and I think it's supported by some of the data, is really those middle school years. You go into middle school, life changes. A lot of things change for the students. Physiologically, academically, a lot of things happen to the students in those years. And so we need to focus on those for us as a law enforcement agency. That's where our emphasis is on the intervention side, is getting into the middle schools and helping the intervention side. One of the things that we're very happy with in our city is we formed 3 attendance centers. We don't call them truancy centers. We call them attendance centers, because that's the goal, is to get students. And again, it puts a positive spin on what we're trying to do. And we don't run the attendance centers. We're able to leverage the CBOs, the school districts, the County of Sacramento. We participate, but it's not an enforcement emphasis. So we go out and we identify those who are truant in our city. We take them to one of the 3 attendance centers. And at the attendance centers, they have social workers, CBOs, the school district, and they work with the students to identify what is their unique characteristic, what is the unique problem that's keeping them from coming to school. And it ranges everything from substance abuse in the family, their substance abuse, all the way around to children who in those adolescent years only have 1 or 2 sets of clothes, and they get teased because they can't wear the same set of clothes every day to school. And keep in mind, we're an urban school district. We're not a suburban school district. So there's some poverty in our city and in our region. So the social workers and the CBOs work to mitigate whatever those things are keeping those students out of school. One of the unintended positive consequences that we just didn't anticipate is that we're not just impacting that one student, but we're finding households that have multiple siblings that are either have dropped out and we can reach them as well, or we've got younger siblings who are following the path of an older sibling, so we're doing intervention with more than just the one student, but multiple students. 2 pieces on that. The school districts are reporting that those students are attending school. They're coming, for the majority, they're coming back to school, and we're talking over 1,200 a year that we're intervening with. And that in the areas that we're doing our truancy pickups and bringing back, we're seeing a reduction in property crime. So the students who were not going to school, I mean, you can make the nexus that they were out doing something, and we've seen a reduction in the graffiti, the thefts, the auto thefts, and the burglaries in those regions where we're putting kids back in school. One of the last major components in this is how do we keep the students engaged? And if I can tell you a quick story, an anecdotal story, we have police officers in all of our high schools, and they also work in the middle schools. Their role is less enforcement oriented. I mean, they're there in case something happens, but we want them to be mentors and role models and to help keep the students in school. And there's a young man named Jeremy who's about ready to graduate from high school, who several years ago was at risk in a middle school. And the officers in this urban middle school formed a mountain biking team. And these kids, they got the bikes donated, and they're competing against some very wealthy suburban schools in our region who have a lot of money invested in these schools, but not in ours. Jeremy was a very at-risk young man who the officers were able to pull into this program to help mentor him to get him through the process. When he made the transition from middle school to high school, he was going definitely down the wrong path. And because of that connection, they were able to use peer pressure with the students in the mountain biking program, plus the relationship he had with those police officers to pull him back into taking that right path. And it was a constant drag. It wasn't something that happened over one day or 1 week. It was 3 years of pulling him back to keep him out of trouble. And in some students, it takes that much effort to keep him in. He's now a leader in his senior year with that mountain biking team. He's a mentor to the other students. He really is a success story. And he's just one of many that we see when you take that individual effort and can identify what the indicators are. And we've identified some of those and drag them, kicking and screaming in some cases back into school. But at the end of the day, they then become the leaders and keep them in school in the process. Some general observations that I have, and then I'll kind of wrap it up and answer whatever questions you have. It's unfortunate, but during tough budget times, school districts cut the programs that impact the most at-risk students the most. Those are after-school programs and some of the trade programs. Those are the ones that are cut first. And it's really unfortunate for us as a state that in my opinion, the best trade training program is occurring in prison industries. And if you haven't been to prison industries at Folsom Prison, I encourage everyone to go take a tour of that, because it's a phenomenal training program, and it's a great trade training program to keep some of the prisoners from being recidivists and returning. But it's unfortunate that it takes going to prison to get that trade training program. We need to get that back in the high schools, because not every student's going to go to college. Not every student wants to go to college. Not every student can go to college. But we still need welders. We still need framers. We still need people, auto mechanics. And we need to put those back in the schools, because the one message that we had from we call it the YAC, the Youth Advisory Committee, is that one, the tipping point is middle school, but students need jobs. And those are the two major takebacks we took from our Student Advisory Committee. One last thing before I conclude, I want to compliment Senators Romero and Steinberg for their Senate bill, because we do need the data. I mean, the data that we're collecting now is actually closer to reality than it was in years past, because we were losing students. We didn't know if they're dropout or they're transferred, and that's all being fixed, which is important for us in our public safety field to identify where are our dropouts and are they really dropouts, and taking a proactive intervention focus versus an enforcement focus at the end of the day. We can't arrest away the problem. We need to intervene in the problem, and the intervention starts as early as preschool and all the way through all those years, all the way through that graduation date at 12th grade. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have, and I thank you for allowing me to come talk to you on this very, very important topic.
No, and I thank you, and particularly for your comments on the career technical training and the absence of those in some of our schools, because I do think that the trend has been towards emphasizing the college-bound students and ignoring the 90% of our kids that don't see college as part of the package down the road. And I was certainly one of those students. I was not a college-bound student, and I think that probably led to some of the situations that I myself found myself in high school. Was I knew I just needed a job out of high school. So I appreciate you giving the perspective of what law enforcement is doing and all the efforts of Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. And I appreciate that a lot of the people who have been working with Fight Crime, Invest in Kids have helped informing the agenda for today's committee hearing. And I hope to work with you as we develop the agendas for future hearings on this select committee. So thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome. And I'd offer you two things. One, we are in Sacramento, so anytime you need something on that. And I would also, if you ever want to speak with the Youth Advisory Committee or have them come speak with you about they're here, they're local, and they're very invested in keeping their peers in school. So I offer that to you.
And my hope is that we will have them, because on our agenda today was for student testimony, because we really do want to get the student perspective of the kids who are going through these difficult times right now. They know there's a budget crisis going on. They know there's not a lot of resources, and I can only imagine what that does to their hopes and aspirations and trying to get the resources that they need. So thank you for the offer, and we will definitely be taking you up on that in future committee hearings.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now I want to move to Anthony Amato, who is the Stockton Unified School District Superintendent. And the reason I asked Superintendent Amato to come in is because he happens to be the superintendent of a school district that had an alarming dropout rate. And I'm going to let him speak to exactly what that is and the history of the dropout rate at the Stockton Unified School District and some of the things that Stockton Unified did in order to address both the data and the causes for the dropouts in Stockton. So thank you so much for coming, Superintendent.
Thank you. Good morning, Assemblyperson Huber, members of the committee, and good morning, members of the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to do is feed off the two previous excellent presentations in terms of how do you operationalize the data from the research, the socio-demographic issues that you just heard about, put it into an operation and make that a systems approach. So I'll approach that systems approach from three directions. First, on the technical side, what can you do? Secondly, on the academic side, what you can do. And third, on the truancy side, what you can do. So those are the three spheres of influence I'll talk about that unify into one comprehensive system. Brief history, in 205-206, when I examined the data, Stockton actually had a dropout rate of about 3%, which was absolutely ridiculous when you think of the city, when you think of the socio-demographics, et cetera. So we all knew that something was wrong with that, but that's how at that point in time we were looking at dropouts. When 206-207 hit and California went to a unified system of looking at dropouts, our 3% ballooned to 54.2% overnight. That precipitated the Johns Hopkins Institute, who looked at 1,000 high schools in America, to label the high schools in Stockton as dropout factories. And that label has pursued us and was something that was touted across all of Stockton and led to our very low expectations of students. When I came in as a superintendent in July of 2008, that was one of the first things that confronted me in terms of A, thinking we had to knock this down immediately, B, raise expectations, and C, operationalize in classrooms to preventative measures so that dropouts would be lessened dramatically across the upcoming years. So the first thing we did was looked at it as from a technical perspective. We brought in everybody in the district that had to do with dropouts. We had dropout prevention specialists, assistant principals, teachers, counselors, anybody that touched the dropout situation. And we had about 70 to 80 people in an audience, and we formulated a plan of attack, if you will, as to how we were going to technically pursue this. We created a war room on the second floor of the district office, literally right across from my office. And in this war room, we had anywhere from 4 to 5 people constantly looking into the computer systems, looking at names, et cetera, and constantly calling and looking for students through relatives, neighbors, et cetera. In the field, we had about 15 people constantly out there literally going to homes. And if you've ever seen that commercial, if delivery people ran school systems and they have walkie-talkies and they said, you know, where's Joseph? And they go out and they immediately get Joseph in the field. That was very similar to what we had. Within 10 minutes of locating either neighbor, friend, relative, or the actual dropout that was out there, we'd have somebody at their door knocking on the door and just pulling them right back into school. And they were just absolutely amazed at how quickly the turnaround was as opposed to not going there at all. And we scoured the city, and as a result of that, we got many students back in. But just as importantly, it turned out to be a huge technical issue. We found hundreds of students literally in adult ed centers that were not articulating with SUSD, Stockton Unified School System. We found students that were in neighboring districts, never having had a phone call either to that district or that district to us to say, we have so-and-so. We found students that were in homeless shelters and just not registered at all. We found students that had literally hyphenated their names. In other words, instead of Tony Amato, it was Tony Amato Martinez, and now I became a different person. I'm a totally different student, and there was no tracking of any of the hyphenated names. So we found a number of issues that impacted dramatically on why we had such a high dropout rate. So we started one by one attacking all of those issues, and one by one we started pulling in students from 1,500. We went down to 1,000, then 500, and we got to a point where our dropout rate today is 17.7%, which is lower than California's 20.1% and lower than the county's 20.2%. So we actually dipped dramatically literally overnight simply by taking care of many of these technical issues. Now, on the flip side of that, the fact that you bring in dropouts doesn't mean that they're going to stay in. And we started redefining the way we looked at this issue. So as opposed to calling them dropouts, in reality, they were pushouts. You know, we met the enemy is us. We're the ones that caused all of this to happen to begin with. So in changing our behavior, we said, well, now that we're going to bring them in and prevent them from going out to begin with, what are our strategies? Well, the first thing is to restructure the way we taught high school and the way we dealt with high school. And the K-8 system was a dramatic improvement also. As was previously indicated, many of the dropout issues occurred in the middle school. But by eliminating middle school, and that already happened before I came in, and having a K-8 system, we saw a dramatic decrease in dropouts simply by restructuring that piece of it. So we've eliminated all the middle schools. We now have a K-8 system, and that has proven to be a dramatic difference in the way we treat our students in those middle years. Secondly, we looked at, again, what was cited in the research, that our 9th grade was the most egregious dropout grade. So we created a program called SONG, S-O-N-G, Save Our 9th Grade. In the SONG program, and also in the research, you saw that the top reason for dropping out in 9th grade was absent days. I was absent too many days. I couldn't make it up. I failed the course automatically. I'm gone. So what the SONG program does is early on in the 9th grade, by August, because we open up our school at the end of July, that's our school year, by August we've already set up an IEP almost for every general ed student in the system in 9th grade. That IEP, mimicking the special ed IEP, simply says, this is your condition, this is what you need to pass 9th grade, here's what you'll probably be challenged by based on your history. So what we did is we revamped the way we teach algebra, because algebra was literally at a failure rate 70%. 70% of our students were failing algebra in 9th grade, so that was clearly a huge issue. Another very large percentage of our students was failing physical science, earth science in 9th grade. Now, for all of those members of the audience that have taken earth science in their past, I think the memories were not exactly of an exciting course of study. You know, it's one of those challenge course of studies that usually you took it as an elective. In our case, we forced all 9th graders to take earth science, and there's a story behind that which I won't go into right now. But all that to say that I was a science teacher in high school also in my early years, and when I was asked to teach earth science, it was the most challenging course in every sense of the word, and to force it on 9th graders was simply ridiculous in my mind. So we changed that. We put in some new science pieces, and we put in a new way of teaching algebra, and we saw some dramatic decreases in our failure rates, so that we've challenged that, you know, position that our 9th graders were not passing those two low-hanging fruit courses. Once we did that, we also said, if you are absent, if you are not going to school, or you have 20 absences, etc., you can now make up your absences in the SONG program. The SONG program literally said you can have buyback days. Buyback days simply means that during intercession, during the holidays in winter, Saturdays, twilight school, you can come back to school, put in the hours you missed, as long as you put in the work you missed and present that to the teacher to whom you missed that work. And if they say, okay, this is CBA work, whatever, you are now buying back all that lost time. And all of a sudden, a child with 10, 15, 20 days of failure days now is back down to maybe 5 or even 0. Some students get so embedded with it. In the previous district that I've done this, they actually went into the negative territory. We actually, you know, they actually had days in the bank. So this is a very successful system that can keep students and retro that whole thing of, you know, too many absences, you're gone. The other low-hanging fruit year in terms of dropouts was the 12th grade. Our seniors coming into our senior year very often, and this happens across American urban centers, weren't told that they were not going to graduate till the 12th hour. Sometime around April, somebody whispers in their ear, oh, by the way, you didn't pass algebra way back when, or by the way, you're missing a phys ed course, whatever. And a 30% rate of that happening at our senior years, students then decide, well, if I'm not going to the activity, if I'm not going to graduate, I'm out of here. So that was our other root cause of the tremendous spike in our dropouts in our school system. So at that point, we also made a program similar to SONG called SOS, Save Our Seniors. The SOS program mimics the SONG program in terms of buyback days, etc., and you have an IGP in August. Every senior right now, as we sit here in Stockton, has an IGP if they're in 12th grade, individualized graduation plan. The IGP simply tracks you right from the beginning to say, are you on track to graduate? Yes, no. If you're missing, let's say 10 credits, 2 courses, we are going to give you those courses in that year. Early on, we start giving you through intercessions, through Saturday courses, through twilight schools. We start giving you all that coursework so you can be aligned to your graduation plans. Now, you might be 20 credits off, about 4 courses. Then all of a sudden you have a different situation. If that's the case, then we make an agreement with you. Okay, you're going to take 10 now and 10 next summer, the summer of your graduation. Now, here's the deal. If you take that 10, we will allow you to participate in the ceremony. I think if I ask any of you sitting in front of me or anybody in the audience, what is the best graduation you've ever had? What is the thing that surfaces to your memory? It's not going to be college. It's not going to be your doctoral degree. 99% of the time it's your high school graduation. It's a big deal for all of us, no matter what other degrees we get later on. And as a result of that, we guarantee that they can participate in the ceremony. That had to be a change in policy because we did not allow that up until that point. If you didn't complete, you did not walk on the stage. And this time we said, yes, you can walk, but you have to sign a contract with your parents and us saying you are going to complete whatever you needed in the summer to actually receive your diploma, and we'll let you walk. Now, here's the caveat. If 80% or more of the students fail to do that, because once you walk across the stage and you haven't completed, what am I going to do? I'm not going to drag you back and, okay, we're taking this graduation away from you. So I have no recourse, but the community has a recourse to it. If 80% or less, if you don't reach 80% of the students coming back to graduate in terms of finishing the course, that celebration will be forfeited from that point forward for everybody else in the community. So in other words, in following years, the deal is off. You cannot walk across the stage if you are not diploma ready. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't have to take care of anything. I didn't have to spread the word out. The community did it for us. In other words, the community, having brothers and sisters and cousins and neighbors behind them wanting to graduate also and not wanting to lose that ability, they took care of our own business, if you will. And 84%, which was the highest rate ever, went to summer school and actually got their diplomas. So that it worked beautifully, and we're going to continue that policy, and I hope I will never have to forfeit it in the future. So those are some of the academic pieces that we put together, as well as turning this year for the first time all of our high schools into smaller learning communities to emphasize what was already mentioned by you, sir, the career tech education programs that is so badly needed across California now. So it's not just about getting to college, although everybody's now being prepared for college one way or the other, but we also know that the skill set needed for college are the same skill sets needed for a high-paying job. So the CTE courses, the career tech ed courses, are embedded now in our smaller learning communities, and that has been our big high school reform that we just launched. Planning all of last year, we've just launched it this year. So with that, we are now seeing that our students are taking more SATs. We went from 7% SAT test taking to 74% SAT test taking. We went from our sophomores not taking PSAT at all, practically 4%, to 84%. 84% of our sophomores now have the PSAT, and we'll continue to have that. And we went up to 48% of our juniors from 6% of our juniors taking the SAT. That system has now been embedded, so now when our next set of seniors this year take it, they would have already taken the SAT in the previous year. They would have been prepared for it through a special course of study, and we're all aiming towards preparing you either for high-paying career, college, whatever your choice is, but you're not going to be left behind. And the interesting thing is, Assemblyperson Huber, that in all of this, we found that out of the 1,348 students who took the SAT as seniors on December 6th of last year, we only paid for about 250 students. In other words, all those other students could have taken the SAT at any point they wanted for free. And I'd also like to say it really didn't cost us anything extra across the board for the dropout prevention or for the redo of all of these academics, for the simple reason that we took existing resources and regenerated them into a new comprehensive program. So it's really the dropout prevention, war room, people in the field, et cetera, were simply the ones already working in schools. We didn't have to add a penny to the entire process. What we did add was an extreme level of collaboration. Teachers, counselors, CSEA paraprofessionals, dropout prevention specialists, they all put their shoulder to the wheel, and it was on the basis of their efforts, their motivation, their change in perspective of push-outs versus dropouts that led to our great success in Stockton. And then finally, going along with the truancy prevention that you mentioned, we have the same. We created this attendance, et cetera. We call it in class. If you dial that number in class, that's our 800 number that automatically allows you to report a dropout. And what we found in terms of truancy is the fact that a lot of our truants were hanging out in, unfortunately, foreclosed buildings. They were creating clubs and gangs, and so now we're going to every little corner, nook and cranny of the city, and through in-class, we're finding more and more students coming back. And I think the saddest thing of all was the fact that as we approached many of our students, especially those who were dropped out for years, they were told categorically by someone in the school, and I'm not putting fingers on anybody, don't come back. We don't want you to come back to school. You've been in trouble for X amount of time. Stay home. So people were actually saying, you mean my child can actually come back to school? I can actually bring it? I said, absolutely. And then we changed that whole attitude and behavior by receiving students not as, oh, not you again, as opposed to welcome back, we were waiting for you. And we have alternative education through smaller learning communities, alternative schools that we've now created, and it's a whole different attitude about how we receive our school students and how we differentiate their learning. So in summary, we had a pretty bad history. We've changed our academics. We've changed our technical way of looking at the situation. And through the in-class program, we've brought in a lot more truants, over 1,000 last year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Amato. And I know of some of these examples since I've been working with you closely since I got elected, and you are still relatively new to Stockton Unified.
Been here for a year.
Only having been there a year, so I appreciate you coming in. And the question is going to be, as we're watching throughout the state for models of success or programs that are kind of just getting off the ground, is whether or not they're sustainable. So I look forward to seeing what the data looks like for Stockton Unified in the coming years, and whether or not some of these programs will kind of take off a life of their own. I do want you to elaborate on one issue, because one of the things that I'm concerned about is, as folks are saying we need more money for programs, how you go about putting together the resources to implement some of these more novel approaches to getting the dropout rate down. I mean, yours are alarming. You've gone from 54.2% to 17.7% in 1 year. That makes you really question whether or not the data was accurate in the first place. And to have the prior year be 3%, you're kind of all over the map. So we haven't really seen a stable number coming out of Stockton Unified. And you went from 7% of your students taking the SAT to 74% of your students taking the SAT in 1 year.
1 year.
Just 1 year's time. So if you could just enlighten some of the folks who might be watching this on TV later, or how you cobbled together the resources to make that happen this is just since 2008.
Yes.
So it's not like we've been in rosy economic times when you put those resources together. So could you talk about that?
Well, we actually looked at the existing resources, and we found that, in fact, we were well resourced in all of these areas. In terms of on the technical side, we had people in every high school that were dedicated to doing this. But when you looked at the support and the systems around those people, they were lacking. So they were all siloed. So they had no way, for instance, let's say Edison High School or Chavez High School, there was no way for them to really articulate with surrounding districts. There were no contact points for them. They didn't have the wherewithal to do that, yet they were dropout specialists, and they were paid, and that was their specialty area. There was no way for them to get to some of our adult education programs or the adult education programs of students taking GED courses in our community colleges. There was no communications, there was no common database, and there was no technological base in which to put all of this data into one pot. They were all working in isolation. We simply took the existing resources and put them all in one place at one time. That's what I meant by the war room. That's what I meant by having a common database and a common technological dumping ground, if you will, where all this data now came into one point. And the 15 people out in the field, instead of being associated just with one particular school, and therefore 3 for this school, 3 for that school, et cetera, they were all one common unified force now and all working together as one unified force. They came up with most of the ideas of how to really make this happen. They came up with a system. You put them in one room at one time, you close the door, come back the next day, and they've got this beautiful system devised that no one's ever asked them to do. No one's ever asked them to step out of their silo. No one ever asked them to collaborate with their fellow workers, the next school, 2 miles away. And in doing that, all of a sudden, we're talking to our neighboring districts. They're more than happy to talk to us. I said, wow, why didn't you ever call me years ago? I could have told you that I have 10 of your students, or some of them even graduated. And we're now looking at software, last year's software that looks at other colleges, because we have students in college that graduated. They're doing very well in college, and we list them as dropouts. So all the existing resources were there. It's all there. We just put it together in a common unified system to make it work. We didn't need one penny extra to make this happen.
Can you talk about the SAT program in particular? Just because I know the example that you used of really the community partnerships that you put together to make that happen.
In terms of the SAT, when we examined why were only 7% of our seniors taking the SAT, here are some of the issues. First, it's only given on a Saturday, and that was a big issue for many of our students. On Saturdays, many of them worked. Many of them had to take care of siblings. Many had football or other types of activities going on, so the coaches wouldn't let them take the SAT. Literally, you had to come into school. Many of them just didn't have the wherewithal to say, what is the SAT? Why would I take that? I don't even know what that is. They had no perception of it. So we put together a package of all community members to say, all of us with our shoulders at the wheel will make this happen. So we brought in the faith-based community so that they can speak about this, during their Sunday or Saturday religious, we brought in the police, of course, in terms of the in-class, in terms of every time we brought somebody in, we wanted to talk to them about going higher in terms of their educational level. We brought in the business community in terms of funding a few of the activities that we wanted to fund. For instance, if you showed up for the SAT, you got a free ticket to the hockey game that night, and we had 1,500 free tickets given out. We spoke to everyone in our community, including the mayor who led the fight for this, to say on that day, all of us have to be cognizant of what we're going to do for our children to let them get to that Saturday exam. So we gave them free babysitting, free transportation, breakfast that day, lunch if they stayed later, because some of them took an extended time. We had the church bells in the city ringing at 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. Yes, some residents were a little bit upset at that, because they wanted to sleep in. But it said to our children, we're all here for you. We had the robocalls on Connect Ed going out at 6 a.m. also. It was a unified effort, and we expected, very honestly, as Assemblyperson Hubert, maybe, 40%, 30%, we would have been celebrating. When it hit 74%, that just blew the roof off everything. We never expected 74%. And students were showing up, and actually the conversations were, what are you doing here? Wow, you're coming. And they sort of fed off each other, and all of a sudden it catapulted into, this can be a cultural norm. This could actually work. And all of a sudden now our graduation rate went from 53% to 70% this year. That's a 17-point increase. And I think, sir, you mentioned with a 10% increase in graduation rate, you have dramatically decreased crime statistics, et cetera. Ours went up 17% in 1 year. And again, this is the teachers, the paraprofessionals, everybody working together to say enough is enough. Stockton can do this, and that effort, it was what made the SAT so successful.
Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate hearing on the ground how some of these numbers are really translated into action. So I appreciate you coming.
I appreciate the opportunity.
We did have time in the agenda for a student perspective, but given the timing of the hearing, we weren't able to get any students here today. We hope to make sure that we get time for student comment at future hearings, but we do have plenty of time for public comment, and hoping that a lot of people will bring in their perspective into this discussion. We have mics at the end of the dais that if you just make sure the light's on so that we can get your voices recorded. I'd ask that you try to limit your comments to 2 minutes just so that we can get as many people as we can before our hearing ends. And with that, I'll allow audience comment. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ernie Silva, and I'm here this morning on behalf of the School for Integrated Academics and Technologies, Sciatec High School. It is a dropout recovery, 100% dropout recovery high school. I'm here to ask you, as you move forward in future hearings and talking with folks, not to forget schools like ours that are focused on recovering dropouts as opposed to preventing dropouts. Once we get the kids in, we got to be dropout prevention too, but we start out by focusing on dropout recovery. And I'm going to leave 2 pieces of information. One is a study that Sciatec did. Essentially, it's an economic argument for dropout recovery in high school. Sciatec has graduated almost 6,000 students in the last 10 years since they've been operating with a fully standards-based, California standards-aligned diploma. So we've got a piece of paper about economic argument for dropout recovery. And the second is a kind of 4 points that we think would help not just unusual alternative schools like ours, but all schools to do a better job of dropout recovery. So I'm going to leave that as well, and I've been speaking with staff about some of these issues too. The big picture thing I want to leave with is there are essentially 5 things that you've heard, I think, some of today and will be hearing in the future that Sciatec does, that other schools can do that really make a difference. First is an individualized learning plan. This is you heard from Stockton, same thing that Sciatec does. It makes a huge difference in helping students figure out where they need to go and where they need to be. The second is, and you're going to hear from some of my colleagues here too, is a career tech focus and partnership. Third is a high-tech, high-touch curriculum. This is a classroom-based program with teachers and instructional aids and relevant software, things the kids will actually use in their lives the moment they get out of high school. Fourth is a focused staff development. As you've been hearing, this is a different population than teachers are used to working with, and focusing staff development on reaching out to understanding the backgrounds and the challenges of the students and how to work with the relevant curriculum makes a huge difference. And finally is a commitment to rigor and relevance. Sciatec is an ongoing one. We're hoping that we'll be able to bring real teachers, and students as well, real folks in to dialogue with you a bit more about what they do and what a difference it can make, and how this applies to others. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we know that there weren't enough copies of the handouts from our speakers today, so if you would like copies of the handouts and you weren't able to get them today, we'd be happy to send you copies. Just let Mandy over here from my staff know, and give her your name and contact information. She'll make sure you get those copies, and I'll alternate mics over here.
How can I do this gracefully? Okay, if I sit, let's try that. This works?
That works perfectly.
Okay. My name is Ann McCaughey, and I'm the president of the Teachers Union in Stockton, California. So that's my superintendent right there. And one point that I really would like to make on behalf of the teachers is that in this year of budget crisis, we need the public to be aware and our legislators to be aware that our teachers are now trying to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And that when you have a classroom packed with 37 kids, whatever age level they are, the brunt of that is perceived that the teacher must do more with fewer resources and less time to do it in. In our district, almost half of our counselors were laid off in reduction in force procedures. And what the teachers are looking for one, is genuine respect and appreciation from the community and support from their administrators. The candy bar in the box on Teacher Day is not genuine appreciation. It's a nice gesture, and chocolate is always good for us. But the teachers really want people to understand what they're trying to do and how they're trying to get it done. Our teachers are dedicated people. You don't go into teaching for the money, and you don't go into it for the glory. But our communities need to understand the great things that teachers do, and that community support is a critical piece of getting our education system back on track. And we also need legislative support. In our school, because of reduction in force, the laid-off teachers have rehire rights, but this is wreaking havoc with substitutes, because now these people are providing substitute services, and because of legal restrictions, you can't bring in the substitute you want sometimes. And none of this is good for education or for the students, and yet this is the situation teachers find themselves in. They want to do well, and yet the fiscal situation we find ourselves in makes the classroom look messy. We cannot mask the problem that an underfunded public education looks like this, and it's not good for students. And when teachers insist upon their rights, they have contractual rights. I'm the union woman here. We're not doing that to be selfish. We're doing it so we can thrive. We cannot spread ourselves too thinly. And so we're asking for community support, community understanding, and legislative support to bring back those resources that have been lost, because if you stretch people too thin, they'll go find something else to do. I taught middle school for 15 years, and here I am. That is an amazing age group. They're wonderful kids, but the physical strain of teaching children and without resources is becoming such a burden that the best and brightest may not be staying in education, and that's what we don't want. So as a member of the California Teachers Association, I'm urging the legislature to look at the prioritization of resources for teachers, and I'm asking our communities to give their support and understanding to teachers who are laboring in an amazing and unusual and very difficult fiscal atmosphere. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And if I didn't say it before, I should say that we recognize that these are very difficult financial times for teachers. I know there are teachers who don't even have enough paper to do work in their classrooms, and it's very hard to teach if you don't have the supplies. So we get it, and this committee is not meant to in any way diminish what's happening with resources in the educational community, but given where we are, how can we continue the dialogue? So thank you so much. Over here.
Good morning, Assembly Member. My name is Bob Tilden. I'm also from Stockton. Hi, folks. I wanted to let you know what we were doing in some of the school districts around Stockton, and I was glad to see that both you and one of your speakers quoted the President's speech that he made to Congress, or I guess he's made it in a couple of places now. But the one about dropping out of high school is no longer an option. It's not just quitting on yourself, it's quitting on your country, and this country needs and values the talents of every American. I was very inspired by that. We were very inspired with that, and decided we wanted to get that message into the schools. So what we've done is we've created a poster that we're distributing in the Lodi, Stockton, Lincoln, Manteca, and Tracy school districts that quotes or paraphrases that quote from the President. So you don't see that? That's nice. Yeah. So our local organization, San Joaquin Grassroots Action, thank you, it is nice, isn't it? San Joaquin Grassroots Action is a local community service organization. We've partnered up with them to help us raise funds to produce these posters, and we've got 3,000 of these classroom-sized posters that we're rolling out in the school districts now. And it's great timing, your hearing here today. Plus, I think on September 8th, the President is addressing the students on, I think, the same topic over the internet. So it's the beginning of the school year and a great time to roll this message out. Our intention here, we have 3,000 of these. We're still producing, we have an intent to produce a larger one for the general area. And we're doing our best to roll these out to the school district. So I just wanted to let you know what we were doing and that we're taking some action in this.
Thank you. We appreciate getting a copy of one of those posters for our office door. Thank you.
Javier Guzman from the Chicano Youth Center, and also a member of the California Child Development Alliance. For us, it's extremely important to understand that the dropout rate is having a terrible consequences, not only on the current group of students, but if the trends continue in Fresno, 27% of another generation of children will be lost to the dropout dilemma. And so we cannot continue to do that anymore. We have to take action. We're requesting from the superintendent of Fresno Unified School District to set up a commission to study and make specific recommendations on policy review and changes. We're looking at addressing the issue from a psychosocial, academic, and family-centered approach. We're not buying the line anymore that closing the learning gap is going to do it, because the patient is bleeding to death, okay? So to us, it's extremely important. Now, I'm going to ask you a question here in the hearing regarding how many of you can identify what a predisposed, high-risk educational condition exists in students. Can any of you tell me what a predisposed, high-risk educational condition is? Well, let me share it with you. Is there a history of incarceration in the family? Is there a history of gang participation in the family? Is there a history of government assistance in the family? Is there a history of single parenting in the family? Is there a history of poverty? Is there a history of unemployment? You know that when the child is born, he or she has no control over those predisposed risk factors, and in our infinite wisdom, we haven't been able to identify what a predisposed risk factor is that affects our children. What about acquired risk factors? Okay? Do you think children are born to be truant? Do you think they're born to fight? You think they're born to emulate gangs? No. Those are learned behaviors that children pick up along the way. They are acquired high-risk factors. I learned how to cut school. I learned how not to show up to class. I was one of yours. The same thing. I'm not proud to say this, but I cut school 19 days in a row, and nobody cared about it. I also decided that I wasn't going to go that way. So I went to Sonoma State and got my degree in psychology. We're invested in the future of California. The microcosm, what we're going to be, is upon us. And we cannot let 54% of the Chicano students in Fresno County drop out. Because of those 50%, they're not going to graduate from UC Davis, from UC Berkeley, from UC Stanford. Folks, they're going to graduate from UC Folsom, UC Chino, UC San Quentin. And that is a terrible loss. And there's generations of children that are moving in that direction. So I ask you to please, please, when we talk about children that are at risk for dropping out, let's not play the same game. Let's not say it's just cutting or just antisocial behavior. Let's look at the root cause. Social, psychosocial assessment. We need a thorough. What does a good doctor do? When a good doctor wants to take care of you, that doctor says, I want a family history. Well, guess what? When you have a history of pregnancy in the family, when you have a history of gang members in the family, when you have a history of poverty in the family, what do you think is going to happen to that child? So we got to get away from just compartmentalizing the child, and we got to look at the child as a whole human being. We don't need more money. We need to redirect existing dollars. And you have a superintendent of schools that's really, really open to that kind of idea. Okay? In a community where the unemployment rate in Mendota right now is hovering 40%, do you think we're worried about existence? Yes, we are. But we're certainly not worried about the budget. Okay? So please keep everything in perspective. There are resources in the Department of Education right now that can be directed towards these areas. In Fresno County, and in the city of Fresno, for example, 5 school districts amount to about 80% of the high-risk population in the entire school district. So yes, we need to direct and target resources to those schools that are suffering, that have a disproportionate number of students who are going to drop out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, Chris Walker, on behalf of 2 clients, the California Automotive Business Coalition and the California Sheet Metal Air Conditioning Contractors. And we're here to talk about career technical education, and we want to thank both the speaker for allowing you to form this committee and for you putting together the hearing today and assembling the very impressive panel of experts to talk about the breadth of the problem. One area that I would suggest that maybe the committee could look in a little bit more is expanding it not just to K-12, but expanding it out to K-16. Because what many people don't realize is that we have a 45% dropout rate in our CSUs and a 20+% dropout rate in our University of Californias. So when you look at the lack of engagement, it's not just in our junior high or in high school, it's also in our universities. And when you look at a general lack of traction, what are we doing with our public resources? We spend $65 billion a year on a public education system that has a high dropout rate in our high schools, has a high dropout rate, unacceptable dropout rate in our universities. Something needs to be done different than what we've been doing. I've handed out a page that's titled 22 Years of Declining California Career Technical Education Enrollment. And beginning in 1987, because that's where the data begins with the Department of Education, we had close to 74% of our students in high school enrolled in some form of career technical education. Beginning of the hearing, you referenced that we've had 3 decades of increasing dropout rates. Well, if you look at what's happened since 1987, the diverging lines of high school enrollment and the number of kids that have been allowed access to enroll in career technical education, it's a striking correlation between the 2 data points. I'm not going to say career technical education is the sole reason for dropouts. I think it's a big contributory factor. When kids don't have the ability to see the value in themselves, how that value lends to society and our economy, they begin to drop out. Our businesses are very much concerned about the technical illiteracy. That's why Bridgestone Firestone and other corporations have become involved to find out what's happened to these shop classes in our schools. They're astounded that they have gone away. It's not a matter of money. Now, we've heard about that a lot. We would love to have career technical education. We just don't have the money. We know in the districts that have it that it's a matter of priority. And we get in this system what we require, what we fund, and what we measure at the end of the day. And we don't require, fund, or measure career technical education and how we evaluate our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have 5 more speakers, and we're scheduled to adjourn at 11. So if we can keep it to 2 minutes, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Cesar.
Madam Chair, members, Cesar Diaz with the State Building and Construction Trades Council. As you all know, our apprenticeship programs invest heavily into training the next generation of highly skilled construction workers. Over $100 million actually between the construction companies and actually union wages. What we're seeing is that there's a very steep learning curve for a lot of these individuals who are coming into the apprenticeship programs and attempting to apply to entry. Over half of them are not passing just a basic entry-level exam. We're seeing that correlates very well with the decline in career technical education, as was mentioned by Mr. Walker. And one thing that I do want to point out is, first of all, thank you very much for emphasizing this and making this a priority as well, but that the private colleges, like the DeVry's, the UTI, those are the institutions that are now filling in the gap for career tech missing in our high schools. And I think a lot of the dropouts are going to those, and they want to go back to school, they want to make a career with themselves. However, they end up, paying $60,000 to $70,000 a year or $80,000. It's very expensive. I think that our schools can better prepare these students so that they can enter the professions that they so seek, like automotive, construction, where they earn higher wages. And I think our education system needs to be retooled, and some of these resources need to be redirected so that these programs are not seen as somehow less than the actual college track. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Jo Rupert Beam. I'm an RN, and I'm the past state president of the California Learning Disability Association, and my main reason for being here is to try to amplify the effect of the California high school exit exam on graduation and dropout rates. And just by way of quick review, you know that No Child Left Behind requires that high school students be tested only once, somewhere between 9th and 12th grade, as to to qualify for NCLB funds. In California, we chose to be one of the few states that has a high penalty graduation exit exam. So instead of 500,000 sophomores being tested one time, we now have about 275,000 juniors who don't pass who are retesting, and over 125,000 seniors who are testing. This can be 8 tests, repeated tests that these seniors take before graduation. I have visited 12 different high schools. I've been studying the California High School Exit Exam since 2001 because I knew it would be an absolute disaster for students with disabilities. I've moved on now, and I'm also advocating policy changes because of the minority students and the impact of students in alternative education settings. I can only ask, if you fail this test as a sophomore, all summer you worry about it. You come back as a junior, you fail it 3 times. I have talked to students at Salinas High School in Sacramento, at Mission High School in San Francisco. These students, it is visceral. They are upset. They feel defeated. They feel humiliated, embarrassed. They are segregated from the rest of the students. They are forced to give up those most engaging classes that would keep them in school, the visual arts, the performing arts, the computer science classes. They have to give up foreign languages. They have to give up sports. They have to give up electives, auto shop, all those courses that make high school fun. So if we could only do what Maine did, Maine, bless their hearts, for their one test for No Child Left Behind, it's the SAT. Every high school student takes the SAT in the state of Maine. That satisfies the No Child Left Behind requirement. We are spending $550 million a year on this exit exam, and the biggest reason is because of this humiliating repeats. And just to close up real quick, anyone, I can't imagine denying that the high school exit exam has negatively impacted graduation rates. The Department of Ed data quest will give you the senior enrollment. For example, in 2001 and 2, 89.1% of the seniors graduated. That meant 39,000 seniors did not graduate. Now let's go to the first year of the high school exit exam. It goes from 89% graduating down to 82% of the seniors graduating, but that meant that 74,000 seniors failed to graduate in 2006. Now, let's just jump, and then I'll finish with this, to 2007 and 2008. Now we've gone from 89% graduating in 2001 and 2 down to only 80%. In 2007 and 8, seniors that were still sitting in their seat in November, 93,720 of them did not graduate. So we have seen this decline in graduation rates and an increase in dropouts since the implementation of the high school exit exam.
Thank you so much.
Please, let's look at what we can do about the penalty of the graduation. And I've got some handouts.
Thank you. Great.
My name is Mercy Thomas, and I represent PICO California, which is a faith-based community organizing network representing about 450,000 families. And I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I would also like to thank you for sharing your story, because as I reflected on my own high school experience, I recall that the idea of dropping out of high school was not an option. And for that, I would like to refer to the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. And whenever someone from outside the village would refer to me as a potential high school dropout, there was enough individuals surrounding me to let me know that that was not the case, and they were there to support me. So with that, we believe that our youth are our state's most valuable resource. And in order for our youth to grow and thrive, they need to be supported inside and outside of school. Resources must be directed to provide them with the support that they need and the services necessary to stay healthy, to develop both mentally and socially, and to graduate high school, prepare for college, or to work, because we want them to know that it's actually a choice beyond high school. Throughout California, PICO affiliates are organizing in local districts to ensure that all students have the programs and are provided with the services and resources necessary to graduate from high school better prepared. And one key aspect of that is our work that is focused on better collection and evaluation of data and improved reporting to the public, legislatures, and communities on that data and how we can put that data into good use. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Terry?
Terry Burns on behalf of School Innovations and Advocacy on behalf of a number of clients. In the interest of time, I'll just reiterate a point and thank Mr. Ashley for making it, that alternative schools in many cases wind up with very high graduation rates because they're getting the kids as a last chance effort. And the continuation schools are working together to put together a save rate for those schools, the number of kids who would otherwise have dropped out who graduated as a result of the work of those schools. I'd also concur with many of the speakers who've talked about the importance of career tech in this effort. But an area that you've missed is gifted students. Gifted students drop out are at a very high percentage of the dropouts, disproportionately high, because their needs aren't being served. They leave school because they find it just isn't relevant. They drop out. Some of them just stay in school and just drop down their level of activity to the norm and just put in the time. Others drop out and they say, I'm going to find my educational needs and meet them in other ways. But a third cohort drops out and says, this isn't for me. I'm going to go and put my energies to use in some other way. And I'm sorry Chief Brazil left, because I'm sure he could back this up and say, I'm going to go in and form an enterprise where I can make a lot of money. And I can put a bunch of people to work doing things I need, and they find themselves creating criminal enterprises that make a lot of money, that put a lot of their other dropout friends to work for them. And this is not the best use of our best and our brightest. We need to serve those kids in a way that they need and meet them in school, and so that we can put them into better uses in our society.
Thank you. And this will be our last public comment.
How lucky. I am Suzanne Brooks, and I have worn a lot of hats, and I want to mention that I'm really appreciative of Member Huber for this hearing. I've been a police officer, an affirmative action officer, director of the Multicultural Center at Sac State, a tutor in No Child Left Behind programs, and more than 40 years of community service. I'm here on behalf of the issue of racism. It's the elephant in the room. It is the major cause of minority student dropouts. I have seen it in every kind of institution from kindergarten up through the University of California. I've worked with groups like BAM. When I was at the Sac State, I went through a lot of problems because I spoke up for 38 students and employees there, and for that I was subjected to every kind of abuse imaginable, threats, demeaning remarks from the Deputy Attorney General, who questioned my gender orientation and my race. And that is, I mention this because these happen to many people like me who are the advocates against racism. In 1954, when the Supreme Court decision passed, we all thought that was the end of segregation. Not so. Our schools are being resegregated. 85% of minority students are channeled to the community colleges, 10% to the CSUs, 5% to the UCs, which means 1 or 2 minority students, 1 or 2 black students a year may become a doctor in the state. Over 50% of the black doctors of this country come out of 3 schools, not in California. We are failing because we always try to change the victim. We do not try to change the system. And I'm not talking about prejudice. I'm talking about institutionalized racism, which lets students at every school that has a bookstore, students who are minorities are followed around as though they're shoplifters and criminals. Students are told to give them deliberate misinformation. I have countered so many misinformation. Minority students at Sac State who've been told not to go to graduate school because that would jeopardize their careers. It's absurd. Students that are told that they're from violent cultures. Students who are taken to task by teachers in front of classes because they are Spanish-speaking and they're speaking to another Spanish-speaking student outside of class time, and some non-Spanish speaker didn't like it, reports it to the teacher, and then that student is embarrassed and humiliated. These kinds of incidents are going on daily. I have worked in No Child Left Behind programs where the person running the program had his son who's on drugs supervising people in the class. And when I reported it, nobody wanted to hear it. I have reported racism for children who are suffering in schools and found that it ties in with their experience as foster children. And nobody in Child Protective Services, including the supervisors, would take my complaints, even though I was working for a foster family agency training foster parents. I have filed complaints with respect to the No Child Left Behind program. Nobody will deal with it. And finally, I want to say this: there is no legal support for people who have complaints of discrimination. You cannot get a lawyer in this town or in this state. If people cannot get legal representation, they cannot fight for their own rights. And the idea that it is unacceptable to even talk about it. So students drop out because they're tired of being demeaned. They're tired. The smartest students go first. There are lots of studies that show that. Until and unless we find a way to keep those people who have the trust of the community. People like me are not invited to committees. People like me cannot get on the State Fair Multicultural Center board or in any of those kinds of situations because people don't want to hear it. But until we deal with that, we will never solve the problem of the dropouts of blacks, Hispanics, and other minority students because they are unliked, unwanted, disrespected. And that goes for those of us who are professionals. Although I have the equivalent of 2 doctorates, a master's, and a bachelor's degree, because I stood up to Sac State on behalf of 38 people, I have been 14 years without a full-time job. The credentialing for teachers, though they claim they want bilingual teachers, and I have 5 languages, and yet I can't get teaching credentials having met all requirements because they made up reasons, because the intent is that I would be silent. So there's a lot of people. I'm not alone. There are thousands of people like me who have the skills to help solve the problem. But unless and until we are included and the children know and the communities know that they are respected, you will never solve the dropout problem.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I appreciate everyone coming to this hearing. We will have future hearings, and I promise to have more members at those future hearings and more students present. If you have any feedback for us on how this hearing went and the different panelists we had and any perspectives that you think that we're missing, please feel free to contact my staff. Jennifer Wanacott here and Mandy are both working on staffing this committee. You can call directly to our office, and I want to thank them for all the work they did on making sure that everyone knew about this committee hearing and getting all of our speakers here and present. And thank you so much. This adjourns the Select Committee on Lowering California's High School Dropout Rate.